power generation, transmission, and distribution. Take it away, Mr. Brendon.
Thank you very much. First of all, I must say thank you to the Climate Tracker team for inviting me. I believe this will be my third engagement with you all, so I must be doing something good. Thank you very much. And I'm really excited to have this conversation with you all. So let me set things up. I'm just have a very short presentation. Let me set up my screen. I'll be sharing my screen, and you'll let me know. Everyone should be seeing my presentation, and I will kick things off. So today I'm here to speak a little bit about, from my perspective, carbon markets, right? Given that Caribbean perspective, and really talk about it in the context of what do we need to understand about this new, or maybe not so new phenomenon that we are seeing around us, and what does it mean for the objective which we're all trying to meet, which is the reduction of greenhouse gases as it relates to the impact in the globe. So what we're going to be covering, some of the focal points would be, what is a carbon market? Why do we participate? Should we pay attention, Caribbean people, should we pay attention to carbon markets? And while reporting a COP, what should we look out for? What are the questions we should ask? What are the insights? And what are the things that we should weigh out as we go about the reporting process? So normally my presentations either take two methodologies. I speak a little bit about meaning, management, measurement, which is the three M's, or the three P's, which is philosophy, principle, and process. So today I'm doing the three P's, and I always start off presentations by talking a little bit about, when I ask the question on the particular topic, I'll always have a philosophy that I will be guided by. So, so one of the things that I thought about when I spoke with the Climate Tracker team was this quote by John Maynard Keynes, famous economist. He says, markets can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. And when you say you, he's speaking about businesses. So even though we're going to talk a little bit about markets and the power of markets, I always reflect that markets are also very irrational. The other thing that I thought a little bit about is what is happening in regards to finance. And finance is the giant that has awoken to the climate risks, that has realized that these risks are material, and it can impact the finance industry, and by extension, insurance, heavy manufacturing, and all the rest of industries, and people, lives and livelihoods. And it's a risk. So my particular quote here is, finance is not necessarily going green, but we're actually greening the finance industry. So it's the same principles and the same techniques and the same processes that finance utilizes, is just that they are falling in line with where the true risk is. And last but not least, and this shows my age, one of the best sports movies of all time, always remember, right? As Tom Cruise said in Jerry Maguire, show me the money, right? So those are the three things that really going to color what I'm about to talk about. But there's a fundamental argument that all this discussion about carbon markets, and there are different points of view, different people see it as something that is good. Some people will say this is not the direction we should head. It requires more stringent controls. But this argument is as old as economic time. Regulations versus incentives. So policymakers will have two broad instruments, and you can have a mixture of both, right? When you're dealing with, you're trying to solve a social related issue or a common issue that could impact in society, where you're trying to influence behavior. So you can utilize the regulatory approach, where you might permit certain types of behavior, ban certain types of behaviors, right? Where you take a command and control approach with regards to dealing with a particular matter, right? However, there's also the incentive approach, and that's the economic approach, because a lot of economists believe, listen, the best way to influence things and to get wide social change and adoption in terms of influencing is to use the market approach, right? Incentives in terms of honey, right, works better than the big stick approach or the whip, all right? Where do you lie? For me, I don't say either or. I say a mixture of both. I don't know if it's because of my background in energy. Nothing is ever truly black and white. It's always gray, dark gray, light gray. But I think there's room for both approaches, both the combination of regulations and incentives. So what is this market approach that I'm talking about? What are these carbon markets? In a nutshell, based on what the UN is saying, carbon markets are a trading system in which carbon credits are sold and bought. Companies or individuals can use carbon markets to compensate for greenhouse gas emissions by purchasing carbon credits from entities that remove or reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So one tradable carbon credit equals 1 ton of carbon dioxide. Right, so that's the technical speak, right, about what this whole carbon markets are. It's like creation of a financial instrument that you're able to sell and buy that represents some sort of real value in terms of a social benefit, in terms of the reduction of greenhouse gases. How many types of carbon markets are out there? There are broadly 2 types. One is compliance-based and one is voluntary. And compliance markets, are created as a result of national or regional policies or international policy or regulatory requirements. Where voluntary markets are national and international, and they refer to the same issuing, buying, and selling of carbon credits, but it's voluntary. So you opt in to the market. So this carbon credit, what is this thing? What is this instrument that you're speaking about? It's really an environmental attribute that is created. So something that you create. When a price is set for the carbon reduction activities, giving them worth or value. So if I'm making a decision to develop a particular project that is reducing greenhouse gases, that benefit that I have created for the world, right? For my country, for my people, for the world, supposed to have value. But the establishment of that value comes from the application of a price. In economics, one of the things that they say as the tenants is that when you price something, it gives it value and it allows you to kind of set the terms and conditions under which that particular value can be used to the benefit of people, whether consumers, mankind, however you want to frame it. So establishment of a price is important. But hold up, there are some important things to note. Price requires rules. In this particular case, well, in all cases, but especially in this particular case, if you're pricing carbon, you need rules. How am I going to account for the value of that carbon reduction activity? Whether it's through a renewable energy project or it's through maintaining forestry, how am I going to account for that? Right? So you must have a common methodology of measurement. You must have a robust system of verification, because I need to, if I design something or I say, okay, this is the effectiveness of this carbon sink, then how do I verify that it's maintained? How do I verify that it's not lost through deforestation? What about the major forestry fires that we have that can destroy that same particular value that I've set up? And then beyond the monetary value, participating in carbon markets exposes countries and companies to serious reputational risk, because everybody is looking at this. They're looking at this particular market. Some people are very skeptical, and they have a right to be a little bit skeptical, because when you have a market, it can be irrational, and you can create situations where there's dishonesty and they're double counting. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a little while. So one of the things you can realize is these things cannot exist without the concept of carbon accounting. And carbon accounting is not just for accountants, right? I have friends of mine who are geologists, who are all different types of fields. who are getting into carbon accounting. And carbon accounting is really one of the core tenets of this whole movement around environmental, social, and governance standards that businesses are trying to adopt. There are different points of view in it, different feelings about if it's effective or not, and that will take time for us to realize. But the principle around carbon accounting is going to be very critical moving forward. So if we have a principle around carbon accounting, we have to have a principle or a process around measurement. And that is important. I think that is a question to be reflected on. Why talk about all this thing, all these concepts, and why we're talking about markets and this carbon market? You see, it's built on the premise that it's very, very simple. Pollution is a market failure, right? So, and a market failure occurs when a market does not allocate resources on its own efficiently in a way that balances social costs and benefits. Pollution is an externality. It has a negative impact, but nobody's paying for it. So if our legislation, environmental legislation, mostly is built on that principle of polluters should pay, then if I apply a price to carbon, then it allows a framework allowed for people to pay. But if you have to pay, then if I'm offering carbon reduction services as a service, then I have a price I could work with for selling that service. So in essence, what we're doing is creating a market. And then once you create a market, you could trade. And once you could trade, you could build capital, build wealth, right? So there's a whole virtuous cycle inside of this that could be positive, but could also be negative depending on how it is utilized, as with anything else in life. So what's the history of this carbon markets framework? First, one of the largest and first sets of global carbon market frameworks that was set up was from the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. There are different views on this. The Americans and others, some believe that, listen, there was a lot of corruption with the system. I know US, China, and others, some other countries actually refused to ratify the agreement. However, it did allow for some levels of investment in developing countries for carbon reduction projects that created credits, where these credits could now be utilized to build capital, right? So there was some level of success. Could it have been more successful? Yes, it could have been. But even though that happened, we've also had successes, major successes with this as a methodology. One of the methodologies utilized in a carbon market is a system called the cap and trade system, or the emissions trading system. Different names means the same thing. This is the command and control approach, where you kind of blend the markets approach with the regulatory approach. And it was successful in the 1990s when it was utilized to actually reduce SO2 emissions from power plants. This would have been in the US, when acid rain was acidifying waterways and impacting on ecosystems and life in different US states. And it was, by all accounts, extremely successful as an approach. So you hear me talking about compliance versus voluntary markets, right? On the compliance side, you will see things like the ETS, right? Emissions trading systems, overseen by different bodies in the US states. For example, the California Air Resources Board has a major market in California in the US, right? Europe has also a major market as well. And that is a cap and trade system, right? Where you actually create credits that has a particular cap, which actually, and the cap is highlighting a maximum amount in terms of volume of the amount of greenhouse gases that can be emitted. And if your business cannot meet that particular target, other businesses that are meeting a target could trade that credit with you, that you could purchase, that you can now allocate to your operations. So the idea is that it creates an external pressure that pushes organizations over time to invest and give them a long-term horizon to now implement a lot of the measures that's required to reduce greenhouse gas impact based on what they are doing in their businesses. And if it is structured properly, what you will find is that cap is actually reduced over time. And what will happen in terms of the price of CO2 will actually increase over time. So the external incentives to change is there. And at the same time, you are able to build up capital, and that capital could be allocated to organizations or governments that you can now utilize that capital into greenhouse gas projects, reduction projects, into climate adaptation projects, and a number of things you can do with it. So this is how the ETS works, right? You see the red line there? You have allocated GHG emissions, right? One emitter might be reducing, the other has to purchase. So with that changing of hands of those credits, once those credits have been verified, checked, seen to be good credits in terms of value to the planet and value to the businesses, seller and buyer, right? You have that trade that is taking place. On the other side, we have voluntary markets, right? Where a company wants to buy a carbon credit, they will go to a broker, a middleman, a middlewoman, who will actually go through the process of verifying outside of like the government framework or regulatory framework. Middle person who will actually go about and verify that, listen, these projects are real, this forestry system is real, this carbon capture and sequestration project is real, they're actually achieving these particular reduction targets. And now you actually have a quality offset that you can measure in terms of value, that you could actually bring the buyer and seller together. Does this sound familiar? It should, because you know that body, that middle body between the buyer and seller should sound very familiar to something that we interact with in our day-to-day lives. It's a bank. That's what a bank brings together buyers and sellers. So it's like an environmental bank that actually brings two parties together to broker a deal. So voluntary carbon markets, there are different views on it. But one of the things that is true is that despite what is happening in our economy, the value associated with carbon markets on the voluntary side has been increasing significantly. This was according to a report done by BCG, which is the Boston Consulting Group, right? So for these voluntary carbon markets to function, right, properly, we have to ensure that there's a source of finance. We have to ensure that there is trust, most important, and there is integrity with everything. And we need to ensure that on the supply side, right, the credits are high quality, accurate, permanent, and offering benefits in terms of biodiversity and local communities. Environmental justice is a part and parcel of this consideration. That's where the whole ESG thing comes in. And on the demand side, we need to avoid the greenwashing by using these credits, right, in a way that is not responsible. And the whole double counting as well. How you actually count the credits and how you actually apply the credits is also important. Another view of looking at this whole offsets and credits, right, is the same thing that I mentioned before, right, where you have some that are natural and some that are mechanical. Natural being environmental based, and then the mechanical ones are like the engineering projects, right? Both are important for how we have to move forward with regards to our objective, which is at 1.5 to stay alive, right? That is important, very, very, very important. So we need both of them. And being allowed to create a carbon credit and trade on them allows us to be able to gain much more project finance that we could allocate to help. But it's important that we properly allocate. And that's a whole other dynamic there that needs to be part and parcel of the questions that we should be asking. If you utilize this as a mechanism and you get the money, what are you going to do with it? So what is the potential of these offsets? Very, very high. You may or may not have known that Tesla, for example, and yes, it is that Tesla, the electric car maker, sold carbon credits to legacy car manufacturers to the tune of $518 million just in the first quarter of 2021. That's a huge deal, right? So not only Tesla selling electric cars, but they actually sold the credits associated with their car manufacturing in terms of the reduction in terms of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases, right, from their manufacturing, from their sale and their product in the market as a value, right? So can we think about this in the context of the Caribbean? And we can, right? We can look at it from the deal that happened between Guyana and Hess, right? And this deal established a price of about $25 a ton for CO2, right? Based on the Guyanese forested areas, right? And the deal actually calls for the purchase of 2.5 million carbon credits annually, right? For the tune of about $750 million, right? And this also includes legacy credits. And they also went to a third party where they would have had these credits certified. But when we think about these deals, we have to think about it from the point of view of the price. Is the price the true value of the asset itself bringing value to the world? And how do we make the determination of if this is the right price? See, that's one of the weaknesses of the voluntary market. In the cap and trade system, the price is the price, and the price increases over time because there's an objective that must be met. In the voluntary market, the price depends. It depends on the measuring system, it depends on what system you utilize, it depends on the structure of the contract, it depends on the deal. So that whole price system is something that has to be clarified as we're thinking about COP. I'm a proponent of pricing nature. Price carbon. I think we need to start pricing carbon. And if we have a proper, I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be a global price, but I think certain countries, Europe has already started. They have a price on carbon. Canada has a price on carbon. US doesn't. China has a price on carbon, although some believe it's lower than it should be, and different opinions, right? But that's whole social cost of carbon is something that requires us to think about. And overall, you'll realize there's this whole concept of that carbon tax, right? Which I think goes hand in hand, from my personal point of view, with the establishment of a carbon market, right? If you want to have a carbon market, setting up a price and setting up carbon taxes, I think is a good hand-in-hand handshake with a good market system, right? And these taxes can be utilized in many ways. As I said before, if you have a price on carbon, you could facilitate a lot of these emission trading schemes. In Europe, in China, China has started theirs, and it is the largest ETS in the world. California as a state, and Washington and New York and many others, right? Canada has launched their own carbon tax, right? And the European Union has also announced a carbon border tax, right? And I'm going to show how all those things tie together. And then you also have the voluntary markets, similar to what, in terms of the structure of the deal between Hess and Guyana. But when we think about that price, look at what's happening on the EU side in terms of the price for carbon. Over 100 euros, which if it is you do the conversion, is about $108 per ton. Compared to the deal that we're looking at, which is at the $25 per ton. Now, I cannot make a like-for-like comparison between what is happening in Europe in terms of prices and what is happening in the Caribbean in terms of Guyana in terms of prices, in terms of what is fair versus what is fair, what is not fair. But what I will say is that not having a standard price for carbon and not creating a baseline or a framework with regards to carbon prices is where you can have these issues. Now, Europe is having particular issues that is causing these prices to go up. But I am seeing an argument with regards to establishment of carbon prices in different jurisdictions so that it ensures that the true value of a carbon credit is established and it is something that we could all agree upon. And why do we need to understand this market? I think one of the linchpins of understanding this market in terms of why this is going to become important is the carbon border tax. And without getting too in-depth into this, the carbon border tax is very simple. It's to avoid carbon leakage. The EU has a carbon price that is going to increase the price, or it could possibly increase the price for certain goods and services. Other countries who trade with the EU could also bring in their goods and services where it is connected to Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. So they are actually putting a tariff on your goods and services within certain sectors when you trade associated with your carbon footprint, quote unquote, carbon footprint for your business, right? So that when you trade with the EU, that it is equivalent in terms of what you are doing with regards to greenhouse gas reduction. So it levels the playing field. So now you can put that into the context of what Hess is doing. Why spend that money? Because if it is you have to access these markets, you're going to have to demonstrate what you're doing with regards to reducing your greenhouse gas impact. Whether it's accepted or not, that is up for debate in the future. However, all companies, no matter where you sit, will be forced. And why I like to talk a little bit about the carbon on this particular point is because the US is going to retaliate, quote unquote, with their own border tax, right? So we're going to have a little bit of a trade war, positive trade war. Caribbean reflection, and there's two questions that I want to leave you with. One, is there a case for establishing a regional carbon price in the Caribbean? I think so. Two, when we sit at COP, we should be pushing for more stringent and equitable carbon prices, a more uniformed social cost of carbon calculation. And I think that is important, especially with regards to ensuring that these prices are fair and ensuring that, listen, when we do get these financial benefits, it is reinvested into what is important, that 1.5 to stay alive, right? Whether it's reduction or adaptation. And thank you very much. I'll close off there and I'll pass back over to our hosts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brendon. That was an excellent presentation. A lot of good information, actually, something that I've learned as well during your presentation. And guys, we'll be taking questions after the second speaker, and I would urge you to jot down your questions and take advantage of this opportunity. We have two knowledgeable experts on this topic. This is a great opportunity for you to get to know more about the carbon market, what role the Caribbean will play in the carbon market, whether or not one single country should tackle it on its own, or should we come under the CARICOM banner. So take advantage of this opportunity to ask these experts questions. So thank you again, Mr. Brendon, for that excellent presentation. And then we move on to our second speaker. She is Kristin Quay. Kristin is currently a climate diplomacy advisor at Climate Analytics, Inc. She has extensive experience in international climate change negotiations on carbon markets and climate finance. Kristin provides support to small island development states on a range of climate change topics, and she represents Trinidad and Tobago in carbon market negotiations under the Paris Agreement. Most recently, she served as chair of the Article 6.4 Supervisory Body, that is the body tasked with developing international carbon market rules under the Paris Agreement. Prior to joining Climate Analytics, Kristin worked with Environmental Defense Fund's EDF on reducing emissions from the aviation sector. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Environmental Studies from St. John's University and a Master's in Environmental Management from Yale School of the Environment. Over to you, Kristin.
Thank you very much, Hipolito, and good morning, everyone. And thanks very much to Brendon for that really great presentation and economics lesson. I think it really sets us up well for what I'm going to talk about next. So my goal here is really to put everything that Brendon provided us with this morning into context, into the international context under the Paris Agreement. So Brendon, you touched on it at the end of your presentation. And what is really key with carbon markets when we're talking about what's happening in the international negotiations and what's happening at COP28 is how can carbon markets help us to keep below 1.5 degrees Celsius and help us to achieve our Paris Agreement goals. And so, Brendon was talking about the fact that we need stringent rules and robust accounting, etc. And that's really key, and that's what we are discussing at the international level. In terms of, just to give a little bit more flavor in terms of carbon market history, Brendon mentioned that one of the biggest international carbon markets was developed under the UNFCCC, under the Kyoto Protocol. And that is referring to the Clean Development Mechanism. The Clean Development Mechanism, the reason why it was established under the Kyoto Protocol was for this particular reason. Under the Kyoto Protocol, developed countries had international commitments to reduce emissions. Developing countries did not. And the premise behind carbon markets is that it allows you to reduce emissions where it is cost effective, so where you can have the least cost. And so at the time, with the CDM, developed countries were looking for areas to achieve their international commitments, but at the least cost. And so what they were finding is that it was cheaper to actually purchase emissions reductions from activities that took place in developing countries. At that time, developing countries did not have international targets. So they were able to engage in projects that reduced emissions and sell those carbon credits to the developed countries. The developed countries use those to meet their targets under the Kyoto Protocol. However, as Brendon mentioned, there are many different views on whether carbon markets are good or bad. And the reason for that, or one of the reasons for that, is because of what happened under the Clean Development Mechanism. There was a lot of controversy in terms of the project activities that took place under the CDM. And the reason for that is a couple of things. One of them is related to this question of additionality. And so essentially, if carbon markets are supposed to drive us towards reducing emissions, you want to make sure that those project activities actually would have happened without the investment coming from the carbon markets, from the climate finance, from the carbon markets. Because if you have a project that was going to happen anyway, so for example, your government decided it was going to install a solar plant anyway by law or regulation, or it was in their Sustainable Development Vision Plan, that was going to take place anyway. So you're not actually driving ambition to reduce emissions if you are crediting such a project. Essentially, what you want to do with carbon markets to really reduce emissions is credit projects that would not have happened because countries did not have the finance to do it, because they weren't planning to do it anyway. But under the CDM, we had a situation where many, many projects were planned, governments were going to do it anyway, but they sort of cooked their books and said, we need this climate finance to be able to do these projects, which wasn't actually true at the time. There were other issues in terms of how project developers design their projects. So for example, some projects had inflated baselines. Basically, how a carbon crediting mechanism works is you have a baseline, which is what your emissions would have been without the carbon markets activity. Then you implement an activity that would mitigate the carbon emissions or reduce your carbon emissions, and you credit between what your baseline would have been, so what you would have done without the activity, and what would happen as a result of the activity. And so some companies and project developers said, okay, without this carbon markets activity, we would actually emit 100,000 tons of carbon dioxide. But now we're going to emit 20,000 tons because of this new project. But in reality, what would have happened without the activity is they may have emitted 50,000 tons of carbon dioxide. So they ended up selling way more credits than would have really actually occurred if they did not implement the activity. And that sort of put a strain on the system where we had so many carbon credits in the system that the price, which Brendon was talking about, was really low, to the tune of like $1 per ton. And so that's not actually driving the carbon emission reductions that we need, because it's so cheap to purchase those carbon credits, and it's not driving the high carbon price that we need to really push ambition and have companies and countries reduce their emissions across the board. So those are just some of the issues in terms of carbon markets that have been raised in the past that cause people to question whether or not they're a good thing in terms of reducing global emissions. I know that I promised to give an update on what's happening in the international carbon market negotiations. So what I'll talk about is Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is basically the carbon markets article under the Paris Agreement. We have 3 articles, so Article 6.2, Article 6.4, and Article 6.8. Under Article 6.2, you have a decentralized approach where countries can engage in bilateral agreements to implement projects that would reduce emissions and then buy and sell the credits from those cooperative approaches, as we refer to it. Under Article 6.4, you have a centralized crediting mechanism, which is more so associated with what Brendon and I have been talking about. That's where you have project developers that would implement a carbon reducing activity with a baseline, and you credit against those, and you result with carbon credits that represent the underlying emissions reductions that take place as a result of that project activity. And those are bought and sold through a sort of banking system, as Brendon mentioned. And then you have Article 6.8, which refers to non-market approaches. And with Article 6.8, you have no trading, no buying and selling of carbon credits. It's more so a flow of climate finance for mitigation activities. So in Glasgow at COP26 in 2021, we were able to adopt the guidance and rules for Article 6. This came after 6 years, so after 6 years of adopting the Paris Agreement, and it was a very contentious 6 years in terms of coming up with the guidance and rules for the Article 6 cooperative approaches. And the reason for that is because you need stringent rules to ensure that the carbon markets actually work properly and actually reduce emissions. So what we came up with in Glasgow is quite extensive and long, but it includes a list of participation requirements that countries have to meet if they want to engage in Article 6.2 trading or Article 6.4 mechanism. We also detailed what the reporting requirements would be, so what countries have to report, when they have to report, and the accounting requirements. And so Brendon was talking about avoiding double counting, and I wanted to touch on that a little bit more because I think it's very important. So under the Paris Agreement, all countries have national commitments that they must achieve. In order to do so, we have to make sure that if you're using carbon markets, no 2 countries are counting the same emission reduction towards their national commitment. Because if we did that, you would end up with a situation where when we look at the reporting and whether or not we're achieving the Paris Agreement, it looks like we're actually reducing more than we are. You'll be seeing 2 emissions reductions for what the atmosphere actually sees as 1 emission reduction. And so in order to avoid double counting, what we adopted in Glasgow is something called corresponding adjustments. And basically, if country A, so if Trinidad and Tobago wanted to sell credits to country B, whoever that may be, we have to make an adjustment to our NDC that makes us work harder to achieve our NDC because we sold a credit that we can't use that credit anymore towards our NDC. And so that's the concept of a corresponding adjustment. And I think Brendon was really spot on with the banking idea. For example, if I send $5 to Hipolito to Brendon, I can't have that $5 in my account anymore. It's gone from my account, I can't count it, and the other person can't count it. So it's the same concept with regard to carbon credits under Article 6. We can't have a situation where 2 countries are counting the same emission reduction to their targets. And so when countries in the Caribbean are thinking about participating in carbon markets, they need to be sure that they are able to meet their NDCs without those carbon credits, without those emissions reductions. And I think that's really important because we don't want to end up in a situation where come 2025 or 2030, depending on when your reporting of your NDC is due, you are behind or you haven't been able to achieve your target because you sold the low-hanging fruit from your own country to allow somebody else to meet their NDC. So I think that's a really important concept that I wanted to introduce here. In terms of what else we've been discussing in the negotiations and our most recent discussions, we've been very focused on the infrastructure to track the movement of the carbon credits. What we refer to them as in the negotiations is internationally traded mitigation outcomes, or ITMOs. And that's under Article 6.2. So for those going to COP28, if you are following Article 6, get familiar with the term ITMOs. You'll hear it all day and all night. We've been really focused on what the infrastructure looks like. So again, back to the banking reference. What systems do you need to have in place in your country to make sure that you can track the movements of ITMOs in and out of your country? What we've used in the past is something called registries. So it's just like a bank ledger or an accounting ledger where you are able to say, okay, I produced X amounts of emission reductions, which equals X amounts of carbon credits. I sold them to this person, or I bought them from this person or country. We've also been talking about the infrastructure for reporting. So we have really stringent reporting requirements under Article 6.2. And these apply to Article 6.4 transactions as well. And the reason for that is we want to make sure that carbon market activities under the Paris Agreement are actually helping us achieve the Paris Agreement goals and not moving us further away from the goals. And so for countries in the Caribbean that are interested in participating in Article 6, you need to make sure you have the things in place to be able to do this reporting. And so, for example, you have to provide an initial report, which is quite detailed, where you say, okay, this is the project activity that I want to participate in or that I'm going to implement in my country. This is how many tons of carbon dioxide it's going to reduce. This is how I'm going to make sure that it is the carbon credits coming from it have environmental integrity or that they are high quality carbon credits. These are the rules that I will put in place to address environmental and social safeguards. This is how I intend to track the ITMOs, etc. So you have a really detailed initial report that needs to be filled out, and you need to answer some specific questions before you can even engage in the Article 6.2 trading or 6.4 mechanism. In addition to that, there's annual reporting and regular reporting. So with those reports, you're going to be talking about how many carbon credits have been traded, how many ITMOs have been traded, where they've gone to, and how you've done your corresponding adjustments. And so countries wanting to participate need to make sure that, one, they have someone or some persons that are able to do that reporting and submit that reporting to the UNFCCC, and that they have access to the information they need to fill out those reports. We're also talking about review of those reports and what happens if there are inconsistencies. So for example, if the US submits a number of reports and we realize, okay, something is wrong here in terms of not adding up in terms of the type of project activity or the amounts of credits coming from the project activity, etc. What do we do in that situation? Does the UNFCCC alert the country that has an inconsistency? Do they ask them to fix the inconsistency or address the inconsistency? Or do they even go further and say, you can't engage in this activity anymore until you fix the issue that has arisen? So that's something that's still under discussion. And for those following Article 6 at COP28, you might want to pay attention to those discussions. We're also having discussions with regard to authorizations. So again, before you can engage in Article 6 trading, the country in which the activity is taking place, the emissions reducing activity is taking place, needs to authorize those carbon credits or those ITMOs to be sold to another country for use towards the other country's NDC. And this is important because you want to make sure that a project developer isn't coming into your country, implementing a project, selling the carbon credits, and you don't know about it. So we're talking about whether or not a country can make changes to authorization. So if, for example, Trinidad and Tobago says, we have this solar plant, it's reducing emissions, and we authorize these credits to be sold to another country, we don't want a situation where in 5 years, they decide, Trinidad and Tobago says, actually, no, we made a mistake, we need those credits, can we have them back? So that's another area of contention that will be discussed at COP28. And I do think that based on the June sessions, we will have many discussions on that issue as well. All of these decisions that will be taken at COP28 are particularly important for the Caribbean once we put it in the context of 1.5 degrees. If we make mistakes and we don't get these rules right, or we allow situations where things can be changed, or we have really lapse in tracking of ITMOs, etc., we can really jeopardize the achievement of the 1.5-degree target. And so we really don't want a situation where countries are selling too many credits, or they're selling credits that do not have high environmental integrity, or that would have happened even without the climate finance coming from the carbon markets for those activities. And so apart from just considering whether or not Caribbean countries should engage in Article 6 activities, we really need to be thinking about how does the engagement of other countries in these activities affect the overall achievement of 1.5, and what does that mean for the climate impacts that we will face. In terms of the Article 6.4 supervisory body, Hipolito mentioned that I chaired that body last year. Basically, that is the body that's set up to set the standards, procedures for the baseline and credit mechanism under the Paris Agreement. And there we're also having very detailed and technical discussions that may be quite boring for many people, but again, they are really important discussions to make sure that we set up the market right. So we don't have a situation where the price is too low, or where we have too many credits, or where we have too few credits. So a lot of those discussions in terms of what methodologies should project developers use to set up their activities, what types of activities should countries be approving, and how should we address the risks associated with certain types of activities are some of the discussions we'll be having at the upcoming supervisory body meetings. There's one next week, there'll be one in September, and then one just before COP. And those are publicly available. You can go on the UNFCCC website and look at the recordings. You can actually look at it live, or if you can't because it happens on German time, you can look at the recordings to listen to the discussions that take place at that level. From the supervisory body, the recommendations are then sent to the parties to the UNFCCC at COP, and parties say whether or not they like the recommendations that the supervisory body gave them, and then they make decisions based on that. So I think that's as much as I will add. I am very open to questions, and I hope that covers what folks would be interested in terms of when they're at COP28 and Article 6 of the Paris Agreement in general. Thanks very much, and back to you.
Thank you very much, Kristin. And again, excellent presentation, awesome knowledge and information that I guess for me personally, and I guess for everyone here joining us today, they appreciate and grateful for our understanding of the carbon market and what it means for the Caribbean, and everyone involved in CARICOM and the region, of course. Now, before we join the audience for questions, let's take a group picture, a virtual group picture. So everyone, if you can, please pose up, I guess, smile. We call it when you put your best smile is a Colgate commercial. Let's Colgate commercial this. Yeah, to Design, can you take a screenshot of it, please?
Yeah, sure. Let me just give people a couple of seconds to maybe put on some clothes if they need to, and so on. But yeah, I will definitely take it. I see some people coming on. You know, this is just like a regular part of calls now, right? Of webinars now. Okie dokie. Man, we have a really nice full house today. Okay, so I'm going to click in one. Just put on a smile. 1, 2, 3. There we go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. And now we go to our Q&A session. You can raise your hand here on the platform for your question, but I see we already have some questions from Joseph from Barbados. So we'll take his first question. So I'll ask this question, and I will pass it on to Mr. Brendon to answer this question. How would a carbon tax affect different sectors of the Caribbean economy, such as tourism, agriculture, and manufacturing?
Right. Thank you very much for the question. Now, a carbon tax does have the potential, depending on how it's structured, to influence what will be the final price associated with the service, right? Whether it be tourism, manufacturing, or agriculture. Now, how you structure the tax framework will make the difference. So, for example, there is some conversations like internationally that you could, for example, add maybe a 0.5% in terms of a percent of taxes on certain activities to actually increase, to actually generate revenue. So the burden is not felt as much. I know recently President Macron and our own Caribbean Prime Minister, Mia Mottley, at the meeting that they had recently, where they were talking about possibly like taxing the airline industry and others. So in the Caribbean in-house, if it is we are looking at our framework, we can see maybe some impact on prices. However, if you structure it properly, I don't see that it can be a major increase in prices. And in fact, if you do a hand-in-hand process where you look at taxes and then you also look at possibly setting up some level of a carbon market, you can actually create a value associated with that particular cost or investment in projects to help reduce the impact on agriculture. So I just recently I was listening to a podcast, just for example, there are companies that actually in the voluntary market that actually contact landowners on the agriculture side and utilize their land and farming processes as a carbon sink. So there's a benefit to them as well. So yes, there is the potential for that, but I think policy well crafted could create a benefit as well with the structure of a carbon tax. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Brendon. We have a question from Vijani. Vijani, you can go ahead and put on your camera, introduce yourself and where you're from, and then you can follow up with your question.
Hi, good day. Just confirming you can all hear me.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Vijani. I'm from Guyana. I obviously really appreciate today's engagement on carbon credits, given how relevant this is to us, how new and relevant this is to us. Thank you both for your presentations. Someone who's been covering carbon credits a little bit more than usual, starting from zero to where we are now. This is very useful to help inform my reporting. Last night at the closing ceremony of the Caribbean Heads of Government meeting, they alluded to wanting a concrete but united position going into COP28. And Mr. Brendon, you mentioned sort of having CARICOM go into COP28 with this one position, but I'm curious to know on the topic of carbon credits, what sort of bargaining weight would CARICOM as a whole have, as opposed to just Guyana going in and talking about its carbon credit deal? Because there's been a lot of talk in Guyana about really showing off our deal at COP28. So my first question is, what sort of bargaining weight would CARICOM have, in your opinion, as opposed to Guyana alone, given that Guyana is the one pursuing this deal? And secondly, on the carbon pricing, you mentioned the $25 per ton. That's actually the higher end that you're getting. It's divided into three. Just for the purposes of everyone else on the call, it's three sets of payments we're getting for three different periods. The last period, which goes in the 2030 decade, is when we're getting the at least 25 USD payments. But there's some bit of flexibility that if the price in the voluntary market goes up, HES has agreed to pay a 60% difference. So I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on that sort of flexibility in the deal? Thank you.
So I'll take the question in parts in terms of my response. The Caribbean as a bloc to be able to negotiate. This is not necessarily my area of competence, so I'll ask Kristin to chime in here anytime, right? So I'm venturing a little outside my comfort zone. But in terms of the Caribbean as a bloc to negotiate, is going to be very difficult in terms of leverage. I'm just talking from my industry point of view when you had to negotiate with unions. That's what I do too, right? It's all about power and influence. And it's going to be a challenge. However, I think what is happening in terms of like the Bridgetown Initiative, for example, I think that movement with regards to the global South coming together, having a uniformed, at least some principles on which they can stand together to negotiate and ask for the reforms that is required, especially on the financial side, I think is where the leverage is. And part and parcel of that, those reforms will have to be some discussion around climate financing. And then inside of there, we can bring in carbon markets and carbon pricing and so forth, right? So I think unity is what is required now, outside of, as you said, not just Guyana, but as a Caribbean. How can we move forward, right? We have to come together, all right? And maybe there's a wider discussion for the global South. Is good from the point of view of being necessary. I think the deal itself can benefit the people of Guyana. My only consideration and the only thing that I'm concerned about is in terms of when you look at the price itself, how did we come up with that particular price value? And is that price a true reflection of the actual value that the particular credit is supplying the world? I'm not sure what the answer to that question is. So is it 25? Is it 35 on the higher end, right? Is it 45? Is it 55? Now, having that escalation factor associated with the increase in prices in the voluntary market, and then you're able to share the upside revenue. That is a good part of energy contracts, and that's a good way in which you create incentives within energy contracts. It's very similar to what you'll see on a power purchase agreement contract or oil and gas development contract, right? However, I still always maintain, okay, is there a uniformed understanding of the value that that service is providing? And is that price a true reflection of that value? I'm not sure what the answer to that is, but I think it's a question that needs to be asked and needs to be we need to dig a little bit more below the surface. And I'll probably hand over to Kristin if she wants to take the policy side of things, because I'm respectful of that work that is being done.
Thanks very much, Brendon, and thanks, Vishani, for the question. So in terms of, again, I think Brendon touched on it. CARICOM negotiating at the UNFCCC, we usually negotiate through AOSIS overall. So, I would like to challenge what Brendon said in terms of power. I do think that CARICOM as a bloc has a lot of power in the negotiations. And we certainly, we have really been the driving force behind the Paris Agreement and 1.5. So I do think we have a lot of power. Where the difficulty lies is how do you reconcile all of the different national circumstances to allow us to have a really strong position going in, and then also you would want to ensure that it is in line with AOSIS positions as well, because while CARICOM has a lot of power, AOSIS has even more power. So you want to make sure that whatever position we go into COP28 with really aligns with what AOSIS has been calling for on carbon markets for years since the Kyoto Protocol, since the start of the UNFCCC, really and truly. I agree. I do think that it is a really good thing for us to be able to have a position on having a very high carbon price, given the impacts that we stand to face as a result of climate change. But we do have to consider, how that affects us and what happens in terms of the cost for goods and services, etc. So it is something that will require some discussion. And I agree. I think it would be good to have the discussion at the CARICOM level, at the AOSIS level, and also at the international level when we get to COP28. But I will premise that, with saying it will be a difficult discussion. I don't think it's an easy discussion to have because it will affect different people in different ways. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Brendon and Kristin. We move on to our next question. It's coming from DeAndre. DeAndre, you can go ahead and introduce yourself and where you're from, and then you can proceed with your question.
Hi, good morning, and thank you for that wonderful presentation, Brendon and Kristin. That was great. I'm DeAndre Williamson. I'm from Nassau, Bahamas. I'm a journalist here. And my question is concerning what the Bahamas plan to do in terms of carbon credits. Well, last year, our government had introduced a plan to sell blue carbon credits, and that's through the power of harnessing seagrass, okay? And this is basically, according to what the government said, it's going to make the Bahamas the first country in the world to sell blue carbon credits. However, they've gotten pushback from people who are concerned that this won't have a long-term impact, and it's just basically a distraction from actually reducing emissions. So I want to know what could the Bahamas do to make this plan impactful in the long term, so people will embrace it, and also how will this blue carbon credit plan be beneficial for other small island development states like the Bahamas and other Caribbean countries?
Oh, thank you very much for the question. And I will take it in two parts. On one side, I think the government and the people of the Bahamas should really, be applauded for taking that move, because I think blue carbon credits offers another unique opportunity for us in the Caribbean, and it's something that should be explored. Now, I agree as well with the criticisms. As I said, it's never black and white, there's always shades of gray. So I also agree with the criticism from the point of view of we don't also want that to be a distraction. You want to be able to set up the framework for blue carbon credits where there is a verification process that is stringent, that you are auditing, checking, and verifying, and ensuring that there is some sort of levels of control to make sure that the area that has been designated is maintained, because that is also important. Because if there's any sort of issues associated with the quality of the credit, it can bring in a lot of reputational risk at the country level, which is something that you don't want, right? So we have to make sure that those things are in place. And at the same time, whatever revenue associated with that particular initiative, if you do the right amount of fiscal policy and the right amount of projects associated with that revenue, you can build even more credits on the mechanical side, renewable energy related projects and so forth, or adaptation projects. So it's about using the financing to create a virtuous positive cycle that utilizes the financing that comes in to help with the transition moving forward. The challenge a lot of time happens when there's a lot of money that flows into governments, into your current account system, and then depending on the local politics at a point in time, money starts flowing in different areas, and maybe not in the areas that is required, that is intended to really benefit. So having rules around those things are also important in terms of how you set up your system for blue carbon markets in this particular case. So thanks for your question, and I'm not sure if Kristin has anything to add there.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Brendon. Thanks, DeAndre. So in terms of the concerns around blue carbon credits, there are a number of concerns with regard to measurement. And so I think that's why the pushback has come. There are questions with regard to the fact that the amount of carbon stored in mangroves, seagrasses, etc., fluctuates significantly based on the ebb and flow of the natural ecosystem. And so you have to have a system that is able to measure that ebbing and flowing of the carbon stored to make sure that you're getting your value for your money, right? Because you don't want to be getting less than you should be or more in that situation. There are also concerns with regard to what happens in the case of reversals. So if, for example, Bahamas decided to protect a certain amount of mangroves, but then Sandals comes and says, actually, we want to build a hotel here that's going to allow for the government to earn even more money than comes from protecting that piece of mangrove, and the government decides to say yes, but those credits were already sold. what happens in that instance? And there is precedence for this with regard to REDD+, reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation trades. So I can understand where some of the concerns come from. In terms of what could be done to, prevent some of the backlash, what I would say is we need the climate finance, right? So there is some merit to not necessarily selling the credits for use towards any other target, but more so selling credits for contribution towards climate finance or achieving your NDCs. And under the Article 6.4 rules, we actually came up with something called mitigation contribution emission reductions. And those ones don't require corresponding adjustments. So if Bahamas sold carbon credits from Blue Carbon, they didn't have to, as a mitigation contribution emission reduction, you don't have to account for it against your NDC, so you're not in jeopardy of not meeting your NDC. And also, you're getting the climate finance that you require from protecting those mangroves, because there is merit to protecting them, right? So yeah, that's my baby passing. So I think that's one of the things that Bahamas could consider in terms of how they set up the framework for it. And of course, Brendon's points were really good too in terms of measurement, verification, making sure the system is sort of just gold standard so that nobody can really attack you for what you're doing, because it is protecting an environmental ecosystem, and it is allowing you to access climate finance, and you're not in jeopardy of any environmental integrity concerns or not achieving your NDC, etc. So I hope that helps to answer a little.
Thank you so much. Thank you both.
Thank you very much, Brendon and Kristin. I have a question. The presentations were really excellent. But in terms of the entire carbon market, everything it entails, and the role of carbon offsets, does that play a significant role in the market itself? Because officials in Belize, where I'm from, they have the view or the criticism that basically carbon offsets is big polluter countries paying smaller countries literally for their climate sins, right? So they get to pollute and this and that or whatever, pay money to countries like Belize that have huge rainforests and a lot of carbon, but the damage is still being done. I would like to get you two views on this topic.
Thanks, Hipolito. I could go first this time. So yeah, I think that is one of the major criticisms of carbon markets across the globe. And what I will say is it ties into a couple of things. One, it ties into the way that carbon markets were set up pre-Paris Agreement. So remember, I was saying that developed countries had targets, developing countries didn't. And so you had a situation where developed countries were allowed to continue emitting, and they were buying offsets from developing countries. So what people found was that the offsets weren't actually allowing for us to reduce emissions. Instead, they were allowing for companies and countries to continue emitting. And what we really need is to drive emissions down. So I do think that there is merit to the concerns with regard to that. However, if we're looking at the international rules, because we recognize that these were concerns, we agreed on a couple of things that would help to address some of those concerns. I don't think that they alleviate them completely, but they do help to address. So the first is corresponding adjustments, the fact that you can't have double counting anymore, and the fact that the atmosphere is only seeing one reduction, and it makes it harder for you to achieve your NDC. So it sort of drives ambition a bit. It makes you have to do a little bit more to reduce emissions if you are selling carbon credits for the achievements of another country's NDC. I think that's one thing that helps to address the concern. And the second thing is what we call overall mitigation and global emissions. And this was something that AOSIS fought hard for. And when I tell you we fought hard, I spent many long nights in rooms having discussions about this, up to the point, I think in Glasgow, this was one of the last outstanding things that we were able to agree on. And basically the concept behind overall mitigation and global emissions is that when you're doing a project, you take some of the credits out of the system so that nobody can claim them, nobody can use them. Those are a contribution to the atmosphere. And so in that way, you're making sure that nobody's claiming them, and you're driving ambition by allowing people to work a little bit harder and making sure that the atmosphere actually sees a reduction that is not being counted by anybody. The sad thing about it is we got a very small percentage of the credits contributed for OMGE, so it's only 2% of the credits. It's quite small. It would have been nice to have a bit more, but we were able to get it, and it's a minimum of 2%. So if, for example, a project developer said, you know what, I want to do really good and contribute even more to the atmosphere, they can do that. The flexibility is there. So I do think that that addresses some of the concerns with regard to carbon markets allowing pollution to take place instead of reducing emissions. And then overall, in terms of the stringency of the system, I think that that helps as well to make sure that we are really trying to drive ambition and trying to drive emissions down. Thanks.
Thanks a lot for your question. And there isn't there isn't a lot I can add to what Kristin would have outlined there. But I could tell you from a person who sits in an energy company now and who sits in energy, if polluters are not allowed to pay, then it normalizes the practice, right? So I think polluters should pay as a principle across the board, right? And I think an escalation in terms of the prices associated with what you have to pay is what business wants. The energy business will fight tooth and nail and say, no, those prices are too high. But in the boardroom, when they sit, they're happy because it gives them certainty. And so, for example, if we have a future price we know that's coming from the capital budgeting side, I can now develop my budgets associated with that new price. So I can go to my board and justify the account expenditure on these projects so that the expected revenue profit or any sort of payment that is expected, it might be a little bit less because of these regulatory factors. So all of the things that Kristin would have laid out is the rules by which we would now operate. So it is a double-edged sword. Yes, the rules matter in terms of how the accounting and the credits happen, but from a principal point of view of polluters pay, I think it should be there. And I think that the fact that it flows to developing nations is just only a drop in the bucket with regards to environmental justice. Yep.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Brendon and Kristin. We'll take the final question, and that's from Darrell Griffith. He writes in the chat, what transparency mechanism will be in place for civil society to evaluate the benefits of carbon reduction projects? Who would want to take it first? Kristin?
Sure, I can take a crack at it from the international perspective, and Brendon might be able to add from his perspective as well. So with regard to Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, remember I was saying Article 6.2 is decentralized, Article 6.4 is centralized. With Article 6.2, it really depends on what the countries agree on in their contracts at the bilateral level. So we do have provisions in the reporting where you have to explain how your projects prevent harm, or you ensure that you have environmental and social safeguards. And so one way they might do that is through local stakeholder consultations, etc. But it's really up to the countries who are working on the contract and agreeing to whatever activity that is being put in place. With Article 6.4, the supervisory body is still discussing how we will deal with this. And we have received many calls from stakeholders to have a grievance mechanism. And basically that is a mechanism where you'll be able to say, okay, the government agreed to have this project activity take place in our jurisdiction, and we see that it may cause these environmental impacts, or we aren't receiving the benefits of the money that's being flowed, etc. And so we haven't agreed on it at the supervisory body level yet. And I do think that it's something very important for us to agree on. But of course, it's a negotiation. And so we have to negotiate it to its death. But hopefully it is something that we will be able to adopt at the supervisory body level, recommend to the CMA, and have that agreed at the CMA level, which is the parties under the UNFCCC. And that way it will allow for civil society to really engage and contribute if there are any concerns with projects and whether or not the finance is flowing where it should be flowing. So I'll pass it to Brendon because he may have additions to this. Thanks.
Thanks for the question. And I must say, I'm a little bit angry with Daryl. I know Daryl very well for asking such a hard question. But in terms of the process, what I am aware of, and this is just from just on the energy side, what I am aware of is I know the countries like us locally here in Trinidad and Tobago, we would have gone through a framework with regards to measurement and verification that would have set up with regards to meeting our Paris goals, and civil society would have been engaged at that level. However, the level of engagement and the communication around the information coming around that processes in terms of the milestones, are the milestones being met? If they're not met, why? How are we intending to close the gap? That sort of part of the process I have not seen. For anybody who sits in the NGO sector, which I do too as well, it's critical for us to go to the meetings and get involved. Because I can tell you, the energy companies send their representatives. They're involved. So I sometimes may have to go at a meeting representing my company, right? Sometimes to these meetings to make sure that these interests are being aligned. So for the NGO sector, it's critical that they are involved and they have to lobby at the governmental level. And once they are involved, that they make sure that there's a process for feedback and monitoring and getting the information. The communication is the critical area that is there for that transparency. So that's just some extra thoughts inside of there. Thanks a lot for the question.
Thank you very much for that. And now we move on to Zane. And she'll be speaking to us about our exciting COP28 opportunity that we have later this year. Zane? You are muted. There you go.
There we go. Thank you so much, Kristin and Brendon, for very, very informative presentations. I was like just enthralled the entire time. A lot of it is very important and things that, you know, we aren't really seeing in the media being explained in a way that people can understand. So it's very important for our community to hear this information and to have a clear understanding of it going into COP28. And on the note of COP28, I'm just here to let everyone know that we have a really exciting opportunity for journalists in the Caribbean to get the potential to report on COP this year. We have a process where we'll be taking virtual. We'll be having a virtual team, I should say, and we'll also be having an in-person team at COP28 in Dubai this year. So, you know, there are a lot of really great benefits to this. You'll get the chance to have expert training, you'll get networking opportunities, of course, you'll get a really nice stipend as well. And you'll be able to call yourself a COP reporter, you know, for some people that's just enough. And I will tell you this, how I got into Climate Trackers through COP at COP21 way back in Paris. And, you know, it's such a great community to be in terms of, you know, networking opportunities and really telling the stories that need to be told. So on that note, I'm going to actually pass over to one of our former fellows, COP27 fellows, Tyrell Gittins, who reported on COP last year, to share a little bit with you about his experience, his lessons he learned, and just overall why you should perhaps consider applying for a COP28 opportunity. Tyrell?
Hi, good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me clearly. Hi, Brendon. Thanks a lot for having me this morning, Dezan, and yes, thanks to everyone for participating in this morning's activity. So I guess, as Dezan mentioned, I'm from Trinidad and Tobago. I'm a geographer and a journalist, and I had the very exciting opportunity last year to be a COP27 virtual fellow. So I have reported virtually on COP27 with Climate Tracker. I definitely have to say that it was a very informative and edifying experience. It was my first experience reporting on a COP conference in the in terms of climate change. Sorry for the word salad there. But the process leading up to it was very, very insightful. We had some training sessions with a lot of interesting experts like Brendon and Kristin in different fields as it relates to different aspects of climate change. So I definitely learned a lot in terms of reporting on the issue from different perspectives and considering different intersectionalities. For example, climate and gender, climate and energy transition, climate and finance, as we would have heard about this morning. So those were some of the opportunities that I had to learn more about climate change from experts in the field who have multiple years of experience dissecting these issues and of course building policies around them. As it relates to the actual COP process, although it was virtual, I definitely felt that I was a part of the process. We worked very closely with the reporters that were there in Egypt. For me, my approach to reporting on COP27 was to take it in terms from a community perspective. I mean, Dezan probably know and well, Brendon as well. I'm someone that is very focused on solutions because in my opinion, we have talked a lot about the issues, and while we continue talking metaphorically and literally, the world continue burning. So we would have received advice in one of the sessions, training sessions. Can't remember exactly who it was that would have given us that advice at this moment, but he told us something to remember when reporting at COP is, these are very large global issues, and it's always important to root it back to the communities and countries that we come from. So as a small island developing state, I wanted to put a lot of the discussion and activities that were occurring at COP27 in the perspective of a small island developing state. So I'd of course focus some of my stories on reporting on the climate fund that we would have made progress towards at the last COP27. I would have also tried to link a lot of the side events because in addition, and this is something you would learn, in addition to the main COP conference, there are a lot of different side events. So as a virtual reporter, I had a lot of accessibility to those events which were being streamed. So I tend to focus some of my stories as well on what is being done around the world and linking it back to the Caribbean. So for example, at COP27, Guyana would have signed a deal, a partnership actually with the EU and several other countries to receive funding to maintain forest cover in the country. So I would have written an article about that. I would have stumbled upon an interesting side session where in Greece, the environmental ministry is actually doing this really interesting project to green some of the islands in Greece and make them more reliant on green energy and have effective waste management and so forth. So I would have written a story placing that into the context of what we can do in the Caribbean with some of our small islands. I would have also in the lead up to COP in one of my stories spoken to one of our social and gender specialists here in Trinidad and Tobago, Amilcar Sinatra, and he would have given an overview of how we can approach climate governance and climate justice in terms of empowering our communities and empowering the voices of citizens to play a greater role in the decision-making process. So just to put a pin in all of what I would have said, I definitely think that being part of an experience like Climate Tracker's training session towards COP28 is very important as a journalist and just a person interested in environmental advocacy to really shape your view and make it more all-rounded, sorry. So when you're reporting on the issue or just, looking in and having a discussion, you can really take it from those perspectives. So I will encourage you to apply and throw your hat in the ring and all the best.
Thanks a lot, Tyrell. for that information. And I hope that anybody who's on the call and, is thinking about if they should apply, I hope that, gave you a little bit of incentive. Also, the process to apply. So the deadline to submit your application is the 31st of July. And all you need to do is head over to our website, just look up COP28 Caribbean. You'll find the web post with all the information. But to simplify it, you just need to publish a story on one of 3 topics: carbon markets, that's why we have this session, the energy transition, which we'll also have a session on, or loss and damage, which we have a session on next week, which I'm really excited for. All of the information that came out of the loss and damage situation at COP27. We're going to hear about that from some very, very experienced people. So look out for it. You just have to publish a story on either carbon markets, loss and damage, or energy transition in your country or the Caribbean, and publish that story, submit it through our application form for the COP28 opportunity, along with a couple of the key questions that we ask, of course, and that's it. And then we will be reviewing your applications and taking them to the next stage, hopefully. So that's it. And I hope that you're interested in applying. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. My email is design@climatetracker.com, which I'll drop in the chat in a few, and I'll pass back to Hipolito.
Design again is climatetracker.org, not .com. But Terrell, thank you very much for sharing your wonderful experience at COP. And again, I urge everyone, but the participants here to apply. It's a wonderful opportunity to network, to grow professionally, and just to be involved in a discussion that's going to be around for many decades. To our panel, thank you very much for excellent presentations. A round of applause. Excellent, excellent. Thank you very much for sharing your knowledge and information and data to the participants. Much needed and appreciated. Thank you very much. Again, just to wrap up, thank you all so much for joining our webinar. We have truly enjoyed this exceptional discussion indeed, and I hope to see you again in the second part of the series next Thursday, 13th of July at the same time. Before we end, I'd love to remind you to visit our website, climatetracker.org, to learn more about our COP28 opportunity, or send me a message at Hipolito@climatetracker.org for more information. I would like also to encourage everyone to join our growing and engaging Caribbean community on Facebook and our great newsletter. Get the opportunity to network, to share ideas with extremely talented journalists from across the region, collaborate and discuss climate-related issues and potential solutions. You could also interact with me one-on-one in these groups. Also, we will be sending out a recording of the session, so be sure to look out for that. And if you have any questions or if you need any help, please reach out to us. And that's it. Have a great and wonderful day, guys. Thank you very much for joining.
Bye, everyone.